Today, we're stepping into one of the most important conversations in marine biology, which is how humans rely on the ocean for food, materials, culture, and even medicine. I want us to think about the ocean not just as a distant place full of interesting organisms, but as a global resource that billions of people depend on every single day. As we move through the slides, imagine the balance between what we take from the sea and how the sea responds. That relationship will guide all of our discussions for this chapter. When we talk about living marine resources, we're talking about all of the organisms we harvest from the ocean for a purpose. Food is the obvious category, but it's not the only one. Many of our medicines come from marine organisms, including compounds used in cancer drugs and pain management. We also rely on marine compounds used in other products for materials like cosmetics and even recreation. Think about how wide that range is. As we go through the next couple of slides, we'll also narrow this broad picture down to a main category that drives most global harvesting, which is food. Most of the living resources humans take from the ocean are for food, and finfish make up the majority of that harvest. Shellfish and other invertebrates also plays a major role, especially in places like the Pacific Islands and the Mediterranean. What surprises many people is how much protein the ocean actually provides. Even though seafood is only a small percentage of the total food consumed each year, it supplies nearly a third of the animal proteins eaten worldwide. This helps us see why fisheries matter so much, and it sets us up for the deeper look at the global fishing patterns. Fishing pressures has increased dramatically since the 1950s. We pushed harder and harder, sending more boats out with better technology, yet the global catch has barely increased since the early 1980s. That plateau is a warning sign that many fisheries are hitting their limits. Some of the most important species in the Atlantic, Pacific, and Mediterranean are now overexploited or fully exhausted. As we move on, we'll keep this idea in mind. Fishing efforts is rising, catches are not, and that imbalance will shape everything we discuss about sustainability. Global marine catches peaked in the 1990s and early 2000s, following a gradual decline. Clupoid fishes, including herrings and sardines, remain the largest catch group but show noticeable fluctuations over time. Cods and related species have steadily decreased since the 1970s, reflecting long term overfishing. Tunas, bonitos, and billyfish show a consistent rise, indicating growing commercial demand. Total marine fisheries reached a high around 1995, then stabilized around 65 to 70 million metric tons. Marine mollusks show some variable trends, with squids and octopuses increasing while oysters and mussels actually declined. Marine crustacean catches have steadily increased from the 1975 to roughly 2018, especially shrimp and crabs. Shrimp show the strongest growth, more than doubling across that period. Crabs and lobsters also rose over time, reflecting high global demand and improved fishing techniques. Krill catches remain low but show a gradual increase, partly due to interest in krill oil and feed uses. Total marine crustaceans harvested grows from about 2.3 million to about 6 million metric tons. Overall, world marine catches peaked around 2000 and then stabilized between 81 and 85 metric tons. Most of the productive fishing grounds are found along continental shelves. These regions have shallow waters, abundant nutrients, and high primary productivity. Because of this, they support large populations of demersal species that are easier to catch. Places like the Grand Banks and the North Sea and the Bering Sea have been the centers of global fisheries for centuries. Understanding these locations helps us see why certain regions dominate the global catch and why the collapse of one area can actually ripple through the economy and the food supply. This will lead us to our discussion on which species we rely on the most. When we talk about the commercial important fishes, we are really talking about the backbone of the global fisheries. These are species that support economies, feed millions, and shape fishing traditions around the world. Many of them are harvested over continental shelves or in areas with strong upwelling because these waters support huge populations. As we move forward, we will see that the diversity of these species is impressive, but they do not all contribute equally. Some groups dominate the global catch, and others fill more specialized roles in the regional markets. Cluboids are the great example of how small fish can actually have an enormous ecological and economical impact. Sardines, herrings, menhaden, and shads are harvested in huge numbers. They are either eaten directly or processed into products like fish flour and fish meal that feed livestock, aquaculture species, and even pets. Then they are used to create fish oil, which ends up in supplements, cosmetics, and industrial products. These fishes are efficient energy transformers in the food web, which makes them abundant and relatively easy to harvest. Cods, haddocks, hakes, pollocks, and whiting make up the cold water demersal species that were once considered limitless. For centuries, these fish supplied affordable proteins to communities across the North Atlantic. They were sold fresh, salted, frozen, and turned into products like fish sticks and surimi. Their story also reminds us that even the abundant resources can collapse when overfished. The Grand Banks cod fishery is the classic example we will talk about next. Understanding the rise and decline of this group helps students see how management decisions can reshape the fate of an entire ecosystem. By the Grand Banks were once one of the most productive fishing grounds on Earth. By the 1960s, massive trawlers pushed this fishery to its peak, pulling in an enormous catch. Then the decline began. By 1992, the Canadian government declared a moratorium to save what was left. That decision caused serious economic hardship for fishery communities, but it was the only option left after decades of unsustainable harvest. Even today, the cod population may never fully return, and that species is now listed as an endangered in that region. This example leads us to the broader category of marine species that fill global markets. Although they do not receive as much attention as cods or tuna, species like jacks, mullets, rockfish, and mackerel make up a significant portion of the global tonnage. Canned mackerel, for example, is a major protein source in many countries and supports food security programs. These species thrive in different environments from coastal waters to deeper rocky regions. Their diversity makes them essential to regional fisheries around the world. As we continue, we'll look at the species that command some of the highest prices in global food markets. Tunas are some of the most valuable fishes on the planet. They live in the open water, migrate across the ocean, and require large, fast boats to catch. Because they command such a high price, especially species like the bluefin, finishing fleets invest heavily in gear like long lines and gill nets. Many vessels even freeze the fish immediately on board so they can actually stay out at sea for weeks. This high demand also makes tunas vulnerable to overfishing, which we will circle back to when we talk about sustainability. Before that, we will look at another major category of seafood that dominates global markets. Mollusks are the second most valuable catch after finfish. This group includes squids, cuttlefish, octopuses, clams, oysters, mussels, scallops, and abalones. In places like Japan and other parts of the Far East, cephalopods are extremely important both culturally and economically. In many coastal regions, bivalves serve as local staples and support small-scale fisheries. Mollusks are also very interesting because they can reflect environmental changes more quickly than many fish species. Their success in a habitat can be a sign of healthy water quality or the opposite. Now we will look at another prize group that plays a huge role in the seafood economy. Crustaceans include shrimp, lobsters, and crabs, and they are prized worldwide. Their high value makes them central targets in both wild fisheries and aquaculture. Shrimp fisheries alone supports millions of jobs. Some operations use bottom trawls, which can actually damage habitats, while others are more moving towards traps or more selective gear. Crustacean prices can rise sharply depending on the season, region, and species, which makes them economically complex but also incredibly important. Next, we'll step beyond food and look at another marine organisms harvested for cultural or commercial purposes. Humans harvest far more than fish and shellfish from the sea. Seaweeds, jellyfishes, and sea urchins are widely used, especially in East Asian cuisines. In Spain, gooseneck barnacles are a delicacy. In the South Pacific, even polychaete worms are collected for food. Some species, like sea turtles and seals, are still harvested despite strict protections. This reminds us that the relationship between people and the ocean is deeply cultural. These practices vary widely across regions and they often intersect with conservation challenges. This brings us to the most biggest issue facing fisheries today. Many marine species are renewable, but only if we harvest them at rates that allow populations to maintain themselves. Sustainable yields in the amounts that can be taken without reducing the population. Maximum sustainable yield is the upper limit that can be removed year after year without harming the stock. When limits when fishes exceed that threshold, populations decline. This helps us frame the idea that fisheries are renewable only when managed thoughtfully. In the next couple of slides, we will look more closely at what happens when the balance is broken. Overfishing begins when catches start to fall even though fishing efforts increases. That imbalance tells us that the stock is being pushed beyond its ability to recover. Market pressures often drive this problem causing because when a species becomes profitable, more people enter the fishery. This creates a competitive rush that pushes populations downwards. Some of the biggest declines are seen in large, slow growing species like tuna, swordfish, and sharks. This sets us up for a deeper look at specific examples of how overfishing has reshaped global fisheries and what these declines look like in real numbers. Many species today are harvested at sizes far smaller than what was typical decades ago. Big-eyed tuna, for example, used to be twice as heavy and 8 times more abundant in the 1950s. This pattern shows how fishing can shift then the entire age structure of a population. When too many mature individuals are taken, the next generation becomes weaker and smaller, which accelerates the decline. Fisheries then turn into a cycle of catching smaller and younger fish. This creates long-term instability that makes the true recovery difficult. This leads us directly to the well-known case study. Swordfish suffered a dramatic decline, with catches dropping about 70% between the 1960s and the late 1990s. Public campaigns encouraged consumers to choose other options, which reduced pressures on remaining stocks. Combined with management changes, these efforts helped swordfish population begin to recover. This example shows how consumer behavior, policy, and science can work together. It proves that recovery is possible when the right steps are taken. Overfishing is only part of the challenge. Habitat destruction is another major issue. Many commercially important species need seagrass beds, estuaries, or mangroves as nursery grounds. When these habitats are destroyed for development or aquaculture ponds, young fish lose the safe space they need to grow. Trawling also damages the seafloor, disrupting communities of organisms that support demersal species. These habitat level disturbances can destabilize fisheries even when catch limits are in place. This brings us to the concept of what happens when an ecosystem and the harvest levels collapse. A fishery is considered collapsed when the population falls to about 10% of the historic maximum. Right now, it is estimated that roughly one-third of the world's fisheries meets that definition. A major study suggests that all major fisheries could collapse by 2050 unless significant changes are made. This projection highlights the urgency of management and conservation. The good news is that the collapse is not the end of the story. Recovery can happen, but only through careful regulation and long-term planning. That will take us into our next slide on managing these resources. Managing fisheries is incredibly difficult because the ocean is a complex system. Maximum sustainable yield sounds straightforward, but estimating it requires precise data on population size, growth rate, reproduction, and mortality. Many species interact with one another, so removing one can shift the balance of the entire food web. On top of that, the high seas are shared by all nations, which means enforcement and cooperation becomes a major challenge. This introduces the idea that management is not just biology, it's politics, economics, and international collaboration. Fisheries management used a mix of tools to protect stock. Regulators can set limits on total catch, shorten the fishing season, or close the entire areas. They can restrict the number of vessels, the type of gear allowed, and the size of fish that can be kept. These rules help prevent overfishing by controlling efforts as well as what is removed from the ecosystem. Marine reserves are especially important because they allow populations to rebuild. Each management method targets a different pressure on the fishery. Together, they create a framework that gives a species a chance to recover. This brings us to one of the most important laws in the U.S. fisheries management. The Sustainable Fisheries Act of 1996 strengthened federal oversight on fisheries. It requires managers to create plans that prevent overfishing, rebuild depleted stocks, and reduce bycatch what is the accidental capture of non-target species. The act applied to both U.S. fisheries and foreign vessels with permits. In 2003, the Pew Ocean Commission called for expanding this approach to include whole ecosystem management rather than focusing on a single species. This shift reflects the growing understanding that protecting one species is not enough if it's the habitat or prey base is collapsing. As traditional targets decline, some fisheries turn to species that were once considered bycatch or low value. Pollock, for example, is now used to make surimi, the imitation crab found in sushi and seafood salads. Other species like lanternfish, flying fish, and some squid represent untapped possibilities. The challenge is that we often know very little about the population dynamics of these species. Without careful management, new fisheries could repeat the same mistake that led to the collapse of older ones. This transition sets the stage for a growing alternative that does not rely on worldwide populations. Aquaculture applies farming techniques to aquatic organisms, and mariculture refers to farming specifically in marine environments. This industry has grown rapidly. Since 1990, the number of marine organisms produced through mariculture has tripled. Farming shrimp now makes up about the quarter of the shrimp consumed worldwide. Other farms species include salmon, milkfish, mullets, abalone, scallops, and seaweed. Aquaculture offers an enormous potential to reduce pressures on wild stock, but is not without its challenges. A wide variety of marine fishes are farmed worldwide, depending on regional demand and environmental conditions. Atlantic salmon is one of the most widely farmed species, especially in Australia, Canada, Europe, and the United States. Warm water species like cobia and milkfish dominate farms in Central America and Southeast Asia. Japan is a major center for high value species such as puffer, red sea bream, yellowtail, and horse mackerel. Bluefin tuna farming occurs in Australia, Japan, and the Mediterranean, and Mexico to support sushi and sashimi markets. Countries like Europe, Canada, Chile, and the United States farm multiple species, including cod, flatfish, and Pacific salmon. Mollusks are widely farmed in temperate and tropical regions. Abalone farms operate in Australia, Japan, South Africa, and the United States. Clams and cockles dominate aquaculture in China, Korea, Japan, and Southeast Asia. Mussels and scallops are heavily produced in Europe, New Zealand, and the United States, while oysters are cultured across Australia, China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Europe, and the United States. Crustaceans, especially shrimp, make up one of the most profitable aquaculture sectors. Major producers include Bangladesh, China, India, Japan, Mexico, Southeast Asia, Ecuador, and the United States. Seaweeds such as red algae and brown algae are farmed extensively in Japan, China, Indonesia, Korea, Chile, and throughout the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Commercial aquaculture continues to expand as global demand for seafood rises. The species we just reviewed highlight how different regions specialize based on climate, technology, and cultural preference. Some niches focus on high-value species like abalone or bluefin tuna, while others concentrate on volumes such as shrimp or mussel farming. As aquaculture grows, it plays a larger role in the supplementing wild fisheries and stabilizing seafood supply. This transitions us towards the environmental and biological challenges that come with farming marine organisms at large scales. Aquaculture seems like a perfect solution, but it comes with major challenges. When thousands of individuals are tightly packed together, disease spread easily, which complicates feeding and increased costs. Water quality becomes harder to maintain as waste builds up. Open water farms can also allow escapes to mix with wild populations, weaken genetic diversity. Finally, aquaculture ponds sometimes replace sensitive habitats like mangroves or estuaries. This sets us up for the discussion on how these ecosystems can be improved. Pollution is one of the most well documented impacts of aquaculture. Farms waste, uneaten feed, antibiotics, and chemicals can leak into surrounding waters. This runoff fertilizes algae, reduces oxygen levels, and alters nearby ecosystems. In places where farm borders rivers or bays, water quality can decline quickly. These issues reminds us how aquaculture needs careful regulation from how many organisms are raised to how water is treated before it is released. This leads us into systems beyond living resources. Humans have always turned to the ocean for more than food. Mangroves, for example, are harvested for timber and charcoal, especially in places where coastal communities depend on local materials for building and fuel. Pearl shells, Pearls, shells, corals, and even sea turtle shells become part of the global jewelry and artisan markets, often carrying cultural or symbolic meanings. There's also a growing interest in chemical compounds found in marine organisms. Sponges, algae, and a variety of invertebrates produce unique molecules that inspire new medicines and biotechnologies. These used expand the way we think about how marine resources. They show how deeply connected people are to the sea and reminds us how responsible management matters across all types of harvesting. Recreational fishing is much more larger part of the marine harvesting than most people expect. When all the catches from the amateur anglers are added up, they amount to about a third of what commercial fisheries bring in. For some species, recreational fishings are also actually the primary source of harvests each year. That level of pressure can shape population trends just as strongly as industrial fishing. Beyond recreation, there's also a steady demand for marine life in the aquarium trade. Everything from small reef fish to invertebrates gets collected to supply hobbyists and public aquariums. All of these uses reminds us that the human connection to the ocean extends far beyond the commercial seafood industry, and they also play a role in how we manage marine populations moving forward. Marine environments supply much more than food. Oil and natural gas extraction is one of the most profitable uses of the ocean, and offshore drilling platforms are common worldwide. Sand, gravel, and salt are mined from the coastal regions. Some countries rely on desalination to generate fresh water from the seawater. Electricity can be harvested from tides and waves. Deep sea mining targets polymetallic nodules rich in manganese, nickel, and copper. This highlights how the ocean supports nearly every sector of modern life, bringing us to the end of the chapter's core content. Tidal power stations tap into the predictable rises and falls of the tides to generate electricity. The idea is pretty simple. As water moves in and out of the bay or estuary, tides follow a relatable schedule driven by the moon, which makes tidal energy one of the most dependable forms of renewable power. The challenge is choosing locations where the tide ranges is strong enough to make the system efficient and where the construction will not disrupt sensitive coastal habitats. Even with those limitations, tidal energy represents an important step towards reducing our dependence on fossil fuels and using the ocean as a sustainable way.